Welcome back to PerformanceLineBearings.com. In the last video we showed you how to overhaul a Performance Line Bosch motor. We had some requests following that to overhaul a Performance Line CX motor. So we've got one here that's been sent in by a customer with noisy bearings, so we're going to pull it apart and see what's required. So the first thing we're going to do is just have a little listen to it. So if I stick a crank on there and give it a spin, that really doesn't sound good. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is remove the outer casing, and before we do that we just need to remove the circlip from the crankshaft to allow the casing to come off. That's our circlip out of the way. Now we have 6 T25 Torx screws around the outside of the casing. We'll get those out. So once we've got our 6 screws out, next just give it a tap with a soft faced hammer or mallet around to break the sealing ring. There's a silicone seal around the plate that you need to just loosen up a bit, and then with a small screwdriver or lever pop the case up. And we can see that this one's in a bit of a mess. Okay, the first thing we can see is the sprocket that sits behind the main motor bearing, and also the little idler sprocket. I can see just visually that the inner bearings of the motor drive are in pretty bad condition, and spinning that you can hear that the bearings are completely shot. We take the main motor gear out from the clutch bearing, and it is absolutely rusted solid. I think this is going to be an excellent motor for you guys to watch us overhaul, because it is showing signs of quite bad water ingress, and you can actually see rust developing on the metal gears, and we can hear that a lot of the bearings in here are in a very poor state. So we'll carry on stripping it down and see what we got to work with. So we're going to take off the main motor drive gear, and normally that would just fall off, and this one does not want to come off very easily at all. We don't see that very often. The bearing has actually seized to the little pin that holds the gear, so we're going to have to press that off in a minute. Okay, next thing we need to do is turn the motor around and remove the torque sensor nut. That's hidden beneath this little plastic cup here. Normally comes off quite easily. There's not a lot holding it on there. And that's our torque sensor nut there. As you'll see, it's a security type nut, but normally you can get away with just using a 17mm double hex socket. Okay, so that's the torque sensor nut off. Leave that for a minute, and now we just need to, while we're around this side, take off the other circlip on the other side of the crankshaft. Like so. That's all we need to do on this side of the motor. So we can turn it back round, pop the torque sensor out. Not much to say about that, it's all in one piece, and we just leave that hanging out the way for the minute. Now we need to loosen off the printed circuit board. Okay, same as the Performance Line motor, circuit board comes off in the same way. We've got 6 little T15 torque screws, so we'll go ahead and whip those out. And you can push the circuit board from the back where the wiring pins connect onto the back of the circuit board, but be very careful, it can be stuck down with little bits of silicone, and there's a little peg there that the board tends to hang up on, so just make sure you work it loose and just bring it away gently. All we're going to do, we're not going to remove it completely, is just take it out and swing it out of our way when we remove the crankshaft. That will give us enough clearance to get that out. So what we have noticed when we pulled the circuit board away is that the circuit board is showing damage all around the edge, very close to the components. This is where the bearings have been so worn on the motor shaft that it's actually started to chew away the circuit board. This is what can happen if your motor's grumbling and you just keep on riding it. So this is why you need to look after and have your motor serviced and overhauled. Right, so we're going to remove the crankshaft and the transfer gears. Now, the transfer gears are loose on the pin and they'll come out with the shaft, but to do that, obviously the shaft is held at the moment by the bearing. And we just give it a couple of taps with a soft face mallet. Now we can pull that assembly out in one. You can see the rust on the drive gear there on the crankshaft. Definite signs that this motor has had a lot of water through it. You can also see rust and water ingress on the transfer bearings, transfer gears. And again, the bearings are very rough, so it looks like we'll be doing an absolute full overhaul on this motor. Okay, the only bearing we've got to worry about now is the left hand crankshaft bearing, which is this one in here, and I can feel and hear that is absolutely shot. So it is going to be every bearing. The only other bearing that is in this motor still is the one on the other side of the actual electric motor itself, and I can feel from that there is no problem with that whatsoever. So we're going to leave that, that's good. So the first bearing we're going to remove is the left hand crankshaft bearing. Looking at the state of this motor and the rust and water ingress we've had, normally this could be punched out. If you was doing this at home, you could drift this bearing out, but it does stand a chance of being a little bit tight, this one, so I'm not going to take any chances. I'm going to push it out on the shock press. Holding this bearing in is a large circlip, so obviously you have to remove that before you try to knock anything out. And also, because I'm going to turn the motor upside down and put it on the press, I have reattached the nut onto the back of the torque sensor and just put one screw to hold the circuit board in place so it doesn't get damaged while I'm working on it. So we'll take out that circlip. I could see it. So that one out. Now we'll push the bearing out. You heard from that bang from the press, that was in there quite tight. See from the state of that bearing, it's very dry, very noisy. So as we saw earlier, we're going to take this little bearing out of the drive gear, but we've got this pivot pin that's actually solid in there. So I've got a little machine screw, and hopefully we can just knock that out. Okay, that looks in quite bad condition, but I'm sure we can get that going again. So now we're going to remove the bearing. So a slightly bigger screw. And we've knocked the bearing out. Okay, what happens when you knock this bearing out, it sits in a little shim cup, and that can come out with the bearing. Obviously the bearing is still in the little shim cup, and you've only got a very thin lip to press on. So what we've got is a little tool with a hole in it that the bearing will go through, but the shim lip won't. And then we literally just knock the bearing out the shim. So now we're going to take the motor cluster apart. We've got a very noisy bearing, so well, a couple of bearings, so we need to get those out. There's a very small circlip, so you need a pair of small circlip pliers on the inner shaft. And then a larger circlip on the outer side of the bearing. So we've removed the two circlips from the transfer gears, and now we've got to press the bearings out. And remove the gears. And set up now for pressing the bearings out completely. Right, because of the awkward shape of this component, it's a very hard job to press these bearings out, and as I've still not got around to making a special tool, basically I can just get a bit inventive. 19mm socket, put it inside on the inner race of the bearing, put a ratchet extension on there, and you hopefully can be able to just drift it out into your hand. And there we have the bearing out of the housing. And now we're just pushing the needle roller bearing from the opposite side of the cage. And that's that one out. Okay, we're now back to the main motor bearing in assembly. So first of all, we've got the main drive gear, and this has got a needle roller bearing in it, and again it's just coated with rust and very rough. So we're going to press that one out. Another one out. Okay, so what we're going to do now is press out the main motor gear and the little idler gear. Doing this is quite tricky because you've only got this surface to press on if you're going to press it out. If I was doing this in my home workshop, then basically I would turn it upside down, soft face mallet or a bit of wood between that and your hammer, and knock the thing through. Again, we're going to do it on the shop press, but we've only got a very small land to work with and a very soft face. One thing you don't want to do is obviously chip any of the teeth off the gears as it's coming out. Sorry, we just had to reset the press because it was too low. We run out of length on the ram. So again, soft wood, and we pushed our motor bearing out. This is the main motor bearing. This is probably one of the more common bearings to fail, and then inside there we can see the right hand crankshaft bearing, and in the back we've got a one-way large clutch bearing, so it'll allow the gear to rotate one way but not the other, so you can backpedal. You may have seen on the last video that the bearing actually stayed in the housing, and we said sometimes it can come out with the assembly, and in this case it has. So we can see our main motor bearing there. We put a puller on there, so I'm just going to pull that bearing off, and then I'll show you the puller in a bit more detail once we've got the bearing off. Okay, so that's our main motor bearing. We can again feel that it's absolutely had it. The puller itself, the main thing if you're going to buy one of these is to make sure that it's got very thin returns on the actual legs, because it has to get underneath that bearing and pull it up. So that's what you need to look out for. So we've taken our main motor bearing off, and now we've got to press out both the right hand crank bearing and the clutch bearing. This is one I probably wouldn't suggest you try at home. It is a really tough ask to try and knock that out. You wouldn't want to do it with a hammer. You damage the clutch bearing, so you would have to take this to somebody with a shop press, or obviously send your motor into us and we'll do it for you. So there's the right hand crankshaft bearing and needle roller clutch bearing out. So all we've got left now is the little jockey wheel. Normally you can just pull that out. I've not found one that's been a problem. You can see again the water and emulsification of the oil, grease in there. With this little jockey wheel there is a roller bearing on the back, which again we can feel is very rough, and there is another little clutch needle roller bearing, which means that obviously the shaft can only go one way, can't go backwards, and we've got to push both of those out. The clutch bearing actually goes through the roller bearing on the bottom, so we've got to push the clutch bearing out of the roller bearing first. You can do that by dropping it into a deep socket. pressing it through. Nice easy one. That's where the needle roller bearing pushes through the gear shaft, so we're going to now push that out. A couple of deep sockets always comes in handy. Last bearing. So we've now got all our bearings out the motor, 10 bearings. As you can see, they're in a pretty poor state. If you've had water go through your motor, it is going to look fairly similar, unfortunately. We've changed the crankshaft O-rings and the chainring O-ring, the motor seal, and the two crankshaft circlips, because they're under tremendous pressure as well. So if you've got this issue, PerformanceLineBearings.com have got a full overhaul kit that's available that replaces all these parts in one hit, and obviously that's available at www.performancelinebearings.com. If you don't need a full kit of bearings, we do all the bearings individually if you only got one or two bearings that require attention, or we do smaller kits. So again, visit our website and pick up what you need. Right, we've had everything in the ultrasonic bath, cleaned up all the bearing faces, everything is clean, basically ready to go back together. So on the next shot we're going to be reassembling the motor. So first thing is the main motor bearing. We've got to drop that in and press it into the gear housing first. Nice and flush before the clutch bearing goes in. So next we're going to push the clutch roller bearing in. Okay, once we got the bearing in, we just want to put a little bit of grease in there. Okay, next we've got to put the bearing back in the clutch gear. And grease that one up. Next we're going to press the main motor bearing back into the housing. With the main motor bearing in, before we put the drive assembly in, we got to rebuild the little idler gear, so we'll do that now. Okay, there's an important thing to notice with this little idler gear. That is on one face it's smooth, and on the other face there's a small lip. And basically once the bearing is pushed right the way through the idler gear, that small lip stops the roller bearing from touching the teeth. The other thing to note is that this again is a clutch needle roller bearing, so it will only allow the shaft to turn one way. And again, the writing goes on the outside and the arrow facing anti-clockwise. We're going to push this now into the gear. It's a tricky one to grease because you can't get your finger in there, so I use just a cut off cable tie. I can smear the grease around, get it on all the needles. And now we're going to put the deep groove ball bearing onto the needle roller bearing. Lovely. It's obviously important to grease these gears, but it's important to grease this particular gear before it goes back into that housing, otherwise it makes it very awkward. So, we greased all the gears, now we'll press that back into the main motor bearing. Take off the excess grease. And we're done. Okay, we're going to rebuild our transfer gear now with the very small bearing and the rubber cup. So firstly we need to push the bearing back into the shim housing, and it's a bit delicate. Okay, we replace the rubber cup, vibration cup, put our bearing holding cup in there. Now we're all built up, ready to go. We're going to put the bearings back in the gear cluster assembly now, and this is a bit tricky on a press, and it would be even trickier if you tried to whack them in there with a hammer, but we've come up with a few ingenious ways. Just one in. Yeah, now we'll rebuild the gear train after we've re-greased all the shaft and gears. Putting the gear cluster back together, there's a few things to note. One is when the needle roller is pushed in, it must be flush with this edge, so it sits slightly proud on the internal edge, so that the gear will sit on the bearing and not on the actual housing itself. So when you put this back together, the large gear has a shoulder on one side that's deeper than the shoulder on the other. That deep shoulder needs to go in towards the large bearing, and the next gear, that can go either way round, and then slide the shaft in from the needle roller end. Now, all back together, we just pop the circlips on, that'll be that done. Okay, we're now back on the main motor housing, and we're putting in the left hand crankshaft bearing, which is our last bearing to go in. That's home, we put the circlip back, and then we're ready to reassemble. We're going to put the crankshaft back into the main motor housing now. Just smear a little bit of silicone sealant on the O-rings before you put it in, to help them slide through the bearings and keep the moisture off. This is a bit of a delicate bit, and the main shaft has to go in with the gear cluster. What you don't want to do is obviously damage the board, so you've got to be very careful. It is a little bit fiddly. So take your time when you're doing this. Last thing you want to do is break something. And we're in. So we replaced the 6 screws back into the printed circuit board. One thing to note with this is the wire for the torque sensor. It basically goes around the back of this plastic housing, and then it's guided into the torque sensor, so it's tucked well out of the way. Just replacing the security nut on the torque sensor. There is no, as I said in my last video, there is no torque settings been released by Bosch that we know of, so just you know, do it up sensibly tight. The only other thing we've got to do around here is put the cap on back on. That looks nice and pretty, and we'll pop the circlip back on that shaft. Okay. Okay, put the little peg back on that was stuck into that gear, and we'll pop the gear on because it helps us align up this outer casing as it goes on. Okay. Now obviously when you take this cover off, it's got a factory seal on it, which generally you can use again. if the seal is damaged in any way, or if you think that the casing has got a chance of leaking, then you can put a bead of silicone sealant around the edge just to stop any further debris getting in. We're just going to put the screws back in now, and then we'll wind the motor up again and see how she sounds. With the 6 screws back in, we can refit the crankshaft circlip, crank on there and give it a spin. That really doesn't sound good.